By Bible, here we will understand the original Hebrew book called Tanakh, which is an acronym for Torah, meaning teaching, Nevi'im, meaning prophets, Ketuvim, writings. It includes the following books, the order and text of which have remained unchanged for the past 2,000 years: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ruth, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The official, generally accepted Bible in the original Hebrew language is the so-called Masoretic text, based on two medieval manuscripts: the Aleppo Codex from the 10th century CE and its contemporary Leningrad Codex, which in turn are copies of even older, now lost Bibles. The Qumran scrolls, discovered in the mid-20th century in several caves near the Dead Sea in Israel, have proven the antiquity and authenticity of the Masoretic text. These manuscripts were created between the 2nd century BCE and the late 1st century CE, and contain portions of all biblical texts. After about half a century of restoration and translation, they were finally published in the early 21st century. In places, the texts differ from the official Masoretic version, but any differences are minor and orthographic and do not alter the meaning. One of the main problems in understanding and interpreting the Tanakh texts is mistranslation. I do not mean unintentional translation errors, but deliberate redactions with a specific purpose. The oldest known translation of the Bible into a foreign language is known as the Septuagint, which is a Greek Koine translation of the original Hebrew text. It is believed to have been created by 72 Jewish scholars at the behest of Ptolemythus II Philadelphus. Several ancient sources mention this: the letter of Aristes, Josephus in Antiquities of the Jews 12.2, Philo of Alexandria in De Vita Moisis 2.6, and the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Megillah 9. The original Septuagint is lost. Today there are only 3 manuscripts that contain the Septuagint: Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, and Codex Alexandrinus. The first 2 are dated to the 4th century CE, and Codex Alexandrinus to the 5th century CE. More than 500 years separate the original Septuagint from its earliest copies known to us today. What we have today under the name Septuagint is a Christian version. Can it be proven that its text is the same as the lost original? After the Septuagint, other translations of the Tanakh into Greek were made by Aquila of Sinope, Symmachus the Ebonite, Theodotion. The famous Origen of Alexandria wrote in a letter to a friend about how he wrote his work Hexapla, in which he compared several translations. With God's help, using the evidence of other editions, we have succeeded in overcoming the discrepancies between the manuscripts of the Old Testament. What does "we have overcome" mean, if not a revision? The Christian Septuagint we know today has semantic differences with the official Masoretic text. For example, the famous verse Isaiah 7:14. Behold, the young woman is pregnant, and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel, as in the Masoretic text and the Qumran scrolls, is translated in the Christian Septuagint as, Behold, the virgin shall conceive, and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. The difference is significant. We will dwell on it below. Things are similar with the so-called Vulgate, the Latin translation created and edited by several Christian authors, the most famous of whom is Jerome of Stridon, known as Saint Jerome. In his version, Jerome changed the original order of the books of the Tanakh and included some Jewish non-canonical books, Tobit, Judith, and others, which are missing from the Masoretic text. The Vulgate has also undergone several corrections by later authors. Almost all Christian Bibles, including those in Bulgarian, are translated either from the Septuagint or from the Vulgate or from Protestant translations. To understand the Bible correctly, it is good for the reader to have at least basic knowledge of Hebrew, the Jewish language. The modern language differs somewhat from the biblical one, but nevertheless, anyone who knows Hebrew can read and understand the Bible in the original. And for those who do not speak the language, there are concordances and bilingual editions, in the original and in translation, which facilitate understanding of the texts. They can be used to study the semantics of each word from the original text, to check the meaning of its root, to find out where else in the Bible it occurs and in what context it is used. Thus, the reader can gain a somewhat reliable idea of the original meaning. We must remember that the Bible is a Hebrew text intended for the Jews and written in their ancient language. Therefore, the Bible presents the worldview, traditions, and characteristics of this people. In addition, its books were written in ancient times, when the ideas about historiography were different from today. In ancient times, it was normal for accounts of events, battles, and kings to include divine intervention, miracles, allegories, and outright exaggerations. All texts from the ancient Near East are like this. For example, the Assyrian king Sennacherib recorded in his royal chronicles, "As for Hezekiah the Jew, who did not submit to my authority, I besieged and captured 46 of his fortified cities, also countless small towns, 200,150 male and female captives, countless horses, mules, camels, cattle, and sheep I took from them as booty." The figure 200,150 is impossible because it is larger than the entire population of Judea at that time. For comparison, 115 years after Sennacherib's campaign, in 586 BCE, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II captured Judea, destroyed Jerusalem and the first, Solomon's, temple, and took several thousand Jews into captivity, according to various estimates between 7,000 and 12,000 people. As was done in that era, the royal family and court officials, temple priests, high-ranking military officers, merchants, and good craftsmen were exiled to Mesopotamia. The majority of the population remained to live in Judea, which became the province of Yehud of the Neo-Babylonian kingdom. According to archaeologists studying ancient Judean cities such as Jerusalem, Ramat Rachel, Tel Azekah, Mizpah, Lachish, and others, at the beginning of the 6th century BC, the population of the entire kingdom of Judea was no more than 110,000 to 120,000 people. It is impossible that Sennacherib had taken 200,000 captives from there 100 years earlier. Ancient Egyptian, Hittite, Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian texts abound with examples that show the way in which the rulers of that time perceived and described themselves and their deeds. What they all have in common is that the gods always protect the righteous and pious king, who is their son, chosen one, or high priest. They send him on military campaigns, and with their help he conquers countless enemies. The king always wins and returns with rich booty. Such were the ideas of the time about historical chronicle. Like any other ancient book, The Bible also contains hyperboles, but they are not a reason to ignore it as a historical source. As in the past, so now, most people are divided into two irreconcilably warring ideological camps. Some firmly believe in the truth of everything written in the Bible, while the others categorically deny it. Both sides are completely confident that things are clear and obvious. For people in the religious camp, historical truth does not matter much. They accept the biblical texts as true despite obvious errors and contradictions. Faith, by definition, is not based on facts, but is irrational. It does not need logic, arguments, and evidence. Believers use archaeological discoveries and historical sources only if they can be interpreted to support their faith, and when this is impossible, they simply ignore them. No doubts about the text, no challenges to traditional ideas, or uncomfortable questions are allowed. On the other side are people who call themselves atheists. They claim that there is no God, and the Bible is a human creation of dubious historical value. Despite the claims to be scientific, this position is actually religious because it is based on blind faith. Even before they start reading the biblical texts, atheists accept the above two axioms, and then, guided by them, see only the things they want to see. Thus, both camps fall into the trap of circular logic, which makes their positions and claims untenable. I believe that if we are to seek the historicity of the Bible, we must, without any prejudice, embark on the path of doubt and questioning, to sift out the possible from the legendary in the context of the era that the texts describe, and especially the one in which they were composed. We must analyze the texts without taking anything out of context to reveal their most probable original meaning, and if possible, to compare them with other extra-biblical sources. This task requires good knowledge of the history and geography of the Near East, as well as of the Jewish people, of the nature and history of Judaism. The so-called documentary hypothesis is a critical study of the Tanakh developed by Gina Struck, Karl Graf, Julius Welthausen, and others. According to this hypothesis, 1. The Torah has four main sources: y. Yahwist, e. Elohist, d. Deuteronomist, and p. Priest. The Yahwist is the oldest of them and calls God by the name Yahweh. For the Elohist, God is Elohim. D lived in the late 7th century BCE during the time of King Josiah and wrote the book of Deuteronomy. The latest author is P and wrote during the Babylonian captivity and after. 2. Four styles of writing can be distinguished in the Pentateuch, which proves four different sources. They were mechanically put together into one, and thus the Torah we know today was obtained. 3. There are contradictions in the Bible that prove different original sources. For example, in Genesis 6:19, God commands Noah to take a pair of each animal, male and female, but in 7:2, he tells him to take 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean animals. The documentary hypothesis was widely accepted in the 20th century, but now many scholars dispute its theses with the following arguments. 1. There is no archaeological or documentary trace of any of the notorious 4 sources of the Torah, which is very strange, if there were any at all. 2. The different writing styles are the subjective opinion of a few epigraphic scholars with prejudices against the Pentateuch. 3. The different names of God are clearly not an indication of different authorship, etc. Of course, the challenge to the documentary hypothesis is not intended to prove that the Pentateuch was written by one man, Moses, or that it lacks later revisions. Such revisions do exist, and they are evident in many places where the texts contradict each other. The value of the documentary hypothesis is that it encourages critical examination of the biblical text, and this should not bother those who believe in its divine origin. In the 20th century, a group of French historians called L'École des Annales, the Annals School, developed a new view of history and introduced the term longue durée, long duration. The idea is that in order to understand historical events and explain their causes, they must be viewed in a long-term context that, in addition to history and archaeology, also includes geology, demography, climatology, hydrology, and other sciences. It is necessary to take into account all the influences and effects, which are often almost imperceptible within 1 or 2 generations, but in a longer historical period play a decisive role. The present commentaries are not on the entire Bible, but on several of its books. They do not set themselves the unattainable goal of proving or disproving its historicity. Not only is this impossible, but it would also be unnecessary. The Bible is not a historical reference book, but a religious and philosophical book, which describes everything that can happen to a person in his earthly existence, and is a collection of universal life lessons. These commentaries are the result of many years of research into the biblical texts and many non-biblical sources. The works of modern scientists from many fields, history, archaeology, geology, climatology, hydrology, linguistics, and others, have also been used. Several original authorial hypotheses have been proposed. The original Tanakh was not divided into chapters. Each book was a continuous text, spread over 1 or more scrolls, depending on the size of the book. This is evident in the published photographs of the Qumran manuscripts. The division into chapters and verses was introduced in the 13th century by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, when he was copying the Vulgate, probably for the purpose of easier citation. Rabbi Solomon Israel in the 14th century applied Langton's idea to the Jewish Tanakh. This practical tradition continues to this day.